Thank you for the person who asked. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available to school food authorities after the conclusion of the webinar. Okay, are there any other questions before I move on to part one? Okay. So the massive first part of our transported HACCP plan is a comprehensive reference guide to safe food handling procedures, corrective actions, and more. Essentially, it's everything you didn't know you needed to know about food safety in school kitchens. If you have a question about how to handle food safely or why it should be handled a certain way, look here first for your answer. If you still don't know or need more clarification, you can contact me or your school nutrition consultant. Part 1 contains comprehensive information with helpful resources, as we just said. This section does not have to be printed, although it must be easily accessible to employees in the kitchen. For example, if it's stored electronically on the computer in the manager's office, staff must know how to find and open the file so they can find the information needed. This part contains the following reference and resources materials about food safety: prerequisite program standards, safe food handling procedures, corrective action requirements, HACCP process information, allergen facts, and environmental health position statements. And let me rephrase, the HACCP process information is actually in part 5, not part 1. So I apologize for that. The slide is correct. The main parts of part 1, as we mentioned, are those first 3, the prerequisite programs, safe food handling procedures, and corrective actions. Prerequisite programs are the foundation of the food safety program, which is providing the basic requirements for maintaining the things that are needed to store and prepare the food. So essentially the facilities, the equipment and smallwares, and the people. Safe food handling procedures are what needs to be done to ensure food is handled safely. These are the day-to-day actions around handling the food itself. Corrective actions are what to do if there's a problem, if a prerequisite program or safe food handling procedure is not followed correctly. Prerequisite programs include food code requirements, other state regulations, USDA requirements, state agency requirements, and best practices. It covers the following areas listed here on the slide, which I won't read the whole list, but you can see here it addresses the disposition and care of the facility, equipment, smallwares, and employees. Safe food handling procedures is pretty self-explanatory. These are what needs to be done to ensure food is handled safely, as I already said. In other words, it's the day-to-day actions around handling the food itself. So the safe food handling procedures are divided into several categories and subcategories, as you can see here. These range from purchasing to cooking, holding and serving, and transporting as well. It also includes reference material like appendices on everything from transportation vehicles to shelf life guidance, and to TPHC procedures as well, among many other topics. On this slide here, you will note that there is no mention of leftovers or what we call pre-prepared foods in the transported meal HACCP plan. This is because having leftovers or pre-prepared foods are not allowed as part of the transported meals plan. That is because you are receiving meals from a caterer or vendor, and you typically do not have the capacity to store any leftovers and reserve them, or to prepare foods in advance, which are what we call pre-prepared foods. So as you will note in the safe food handling procedures and corrective actions, there is no use of advanced preparation of TCS foods, which is that pre-prepared foods, and there's also no saving of leftover foods at the end of meal service. Corrective actions, as we've said already, are what to do if a standard is not met. In other words, there's an issue with controlling a potential hazard. This could occur if prerequisite programs or safe food handling procedures are not followed correctly or at all. Corrective actions are based on the critical control points and critical limits established in the safe food handling procedures. This is part of the HACCP process, so as part of the plan, we have to include corrective actions. If you have an issue with a safe food handling or prerequisite procedure not working properly or not being followed at all, go to the corrective actions section of Part 1 to see how to address it and fix the issue. The end of Part 1 includes some additional information and resources as reference. The TCS Foods information that used to be in Part 5, which is our menus and recipes section, was moved to Part 1 last year since it was really just reference material. A large section on allergen awareness and management is also towards the end of Part 1. The last section of Part 1 contains what we consider position statements from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Environmental Health section. This is the state group that oversees the local health inspectors. When we have a question or an issue related to interpretation or implementation of the food code regulations or any other state food safety regulations, we reach out to our contacts there for clarification, and often this results in the development of a position statement. We do not include all of their position statements in our HACCP plan template. We only try to include the relevant ones. Position statements include topics such as sharing tables and donated foods, packaged food handling and labeling, facilities-related guidance, and shared use kitchens. A full list of their position statements can be found at the link on the first page of the position statement section in Part 1 of our HACCP plan. You will also note here there is a position statement related to permit guidance that should echo what I've shared with you already about food establishment permits. For school year 24-25, we've added that position statement, although it is dated from 2016, because we've recently gotten a lot of questions in this area, so we wanted to include that as part of this year's template. For those of you who attended yesterday, the commercial plan webinar, I wanted to include this comparison between the commercial and transported plan, just so you can see some of the differences in Part 1. So the commercial plan gives basic guidance on food establishment permits in that position statement. We did also include that in the transported plan, along with some additional written guidance, which you'll find at the beginning of Part 1. The commercial plan does provide written guidance on leftovers and pre-prepared foods, although as I just mentioned, we did not include that information in the transported plan because these are not practices that should be going on in a transported operation. These are a list of some frequently asked questions or areas we get a lot of questions about, so we wanted to include where to find more information on these topics. So we do get a lot of questions on sharing tables, and as you can see, you can find information in several places of Part 1. The prerequisite programs section, the safe food handling procedures, and also the position statement section have information on sharing tables, as well as some donated foods guidance. TPHC information, there is information in Part 1 as well as Part 5, but there is a sample procedure that is part of this Part 1 section. I apologize, I meant to take the safe methods for cooling foods out of this list because those in the transport operation should not be cooling and saving any foods. I will update this slide before we send out the recording. And bodily fluid cleanup procedures is another thing that often gets asked. This is probably more pertinent to the commercial plan for those who are preparing food on site. Your health inspector would ask for those, but it is also important for everyone related to a food safety operation to know how to handle those types of incidents. Again, please disregard the dish machine temperature requirements. Most of you probably do not have a dish machine, but we do often get questions about that. Food safety continuing education requirements, and we'll address these in more detail when we get to part 4. Power outage resources, and then also food safety recall sample operating procedures, standard operating procedures can be found there. And as we'll talk about allergen awareness training later, there is a good section on allergen information at the end of part 1, as we already mentioned.